June 14, 1942, near the French town of Saint-Lô. The morning fog clung to the fields like smoke from a dying fire. Dew gathered on the long grass, bending under the weight of steel treads as a German Panzer IV crept along a narrow country road. Inside, the engine rumbled low and confident, the sound of superiority. Oberfeldwebel Kurt Reinhardt, commander of the 21st Panzer Division's lead tank, leaned out of the turret hatch, binoculars pressed to his eyes. He'd been told that American armor was finally appearing in the European theater, something called the M4 Sherman. He smirked. "A toy," he muttered to his driver. "Thin armor, weak gun, built for parades, not war." The men laughed. They'd faced British Crusaders and Matildas before, cumbersome machines that German shells tore through like paper. A few kilometers ahead, the first Shermans had rolled ashore from Allied landings. Their olive-drab paint still gleamed with sea salt. Crews were young, many in their early 20s, men from Kansas, Ohio, and Michigan who had only seen tanks in training manuals. The Shermans clanked forward, their engines roaring through the hedgerows, nervous but determined. The first meeting came without warning. Reinhardt's gunner spotted movement through the mist, a rounded turret, a high profile, and that unfamiliar star on the hull. "Fire!" The Panzer's 75 cannon thundered. The shell struck the Sherman square on its front plate, tearing through and igniting the ammunition inside. The tank erupted in a flash of orange flame. The Germans roared with laughter inside their steel fortress. "So this is America's great weapon," Reinhardt sneered. "They send coffins on tracks." The laughter echoed across the French fields, a cruel, confident sound that carried through the smoke. What the Germans didn't know, not yet, was that the machine they mocked was never meant to fight on even terms. The Sherman wasn't built to win a duel. It was built to win a war of movement, a war of supply, a war of endurance. And before long, its numbers would blot out the horizon. Detroit, Michigan, December 1942. Snow drifted past the factory windows like ash. Inside the Chrysler tank arsenal, the floor trembled with the rhythm of production, presses pounding, welders hissing, cranes groaning under the weight of raw steel. Men and women worked shoulder to shoulder, their faces smeared with oil, their breath visible in the cold. Rows of M4 Shermans stood half-assembled beneath the fluorescent glare, each one a symbol of something Germany had underestimated: America's industrial muscle. Every 4 hours, another tank rolled off the line. Every day, the workers built enough machines to equip an entire battalion. They called it the arsenal of democracy. While Reinhardt and his men mocked from the fields of France, engineers in Detroit were reimagining how wars were fought, not by elite divisions or tactical brilliance, but by logistics, production, and the unstoppable rhythm of a factory that never slept. The numbers grew like a tide: 500 tanks, 1,000, 5,000. By mid-1943, nearly 50,000 Shermans were in motion, crossing the Atlantic on Liberty ships, landing in Sicily, North Africa, and Normandy. Each one simple, reliable, and easy to repair. Each one part of a machine larger than any one soldier could see. Meanwhile, in the ruins of a captured French village, Reinhardt's laughter began to fade. He had received new orders. Reconnaissance reports warned of large-scale American armor movements near Kasserine, but the intelligence felt exaggerated. Until that morning. The desert sun rose like fire over the Tunisian hills. Dust clouds swelled on the horizon, not from a few tanks but from hundreds. Sherman after Sherman appeared, stretched across the valley like an army of ants made of iron. The Germans opened fire. Their shells struck true, but for every Sherman burning, 2 more emerged from the haze. Reinhardt's radio crackled with panic. "They just keep coming." The myth of German invincibility began to tremble beneath the weight of American industry. What the Germans saw that day wasn't a single army. It was the roar of an entire nation, one that had turned its factories into forges and its workers into soldiers of production. And for the first time, the laughter inside the Panzer IV went silent. June 7, 1944, near Saint-Lô, Normandy. The rain had stopped, but the smoke hadn't. The air was thick with cordite and diesel, the ground churned into a muddy stew of blood, oil, and crushed wheat. Through the haze, the rhythmic growl of engines echoed, the sound of hundreds of M4 Shermans grinding forward through the hedgerows. Private James Mallory sat cramped inside one of them, helmet pressed against the steel wall, the smell of gasoline and fear clinging to every breath. His commander, Lieutenant Harris, tapped the side of the turret, whispering to his gunner, "Panzers out there, keep your eyes peeled." The fields of Normandy had become a labyrinth, narrow lanes hemmed by thick, centuries-old hedges that could hide an ambush in every shadow. Somewhere ahead, German armor waited, Panthers and Tigers, their guns longer, their armor thicker. Every American tanker knew the odds. One-on-one, a Sherman didn't stand a chance. But this wasn't a duel, it was a storm. From above, Allied planes screamed through the clouds. Thunderbolts and typhoons dropped rockets on enemy positions while infantry moved alongside the Shermans, marking targets with flares. The coordination was relentless, a moving wall of steel, air, and fire. Then came the first hit. A Tiger's shell ripped through the lead Sherman, tearing the turret clean off. Mallory's heart froze, the radio filled with static and shouts. Tiger 11 o'clock. Lieutenant Harris swung the turret, the 75mm cannon barking in reply. The round clanged uselessly off the Tiger's front armor. Harris cursed, "We can't take him head-on." Instead, they maneuvered fast, nimble, using terrain as their weapon. Two Shermans circled wide through the hedgerow, flanking the Tiger's exposed side. They fired in unison, two armor-piercing shells slamming into the thinner rear plating. The Tiger belched smoke, then burst into flames. "Got him," someone yelled. The radio erupted in cheers. For the first time since France fell, German soldiers saw their own monsters burn. Reinhardt, older now, worn and silent, watched from a ruined farmhouse as the column of Shermans advanced past his position. His once-proud Panzer division was down to a handful of machines. Their precious Tigers were broken, trapped, or out of fuel. He stared as another wave of American tanks rolled through the village, engines humming, crews confident, stars painted white on their hulls. One of them bore a name scrawled in chalk across its armor, Hell's Highway. Reinhardt exhaled, muttering to no one in particular, "They just keep coming." The laughter from 1942 was gone, replaced by something colder. A realization that Germany's might, for all its engineering brilliance, was being buried under a tide of steel and willpower. The M4 Sherman wasn't a perfect tank, but it didn't need to be. It only needed to keep rolling forward, and it did, all the way through the heart of Europe, August 1944. Near the Falaise pocket, northern France. The French countryside burned under a sky of black smoke and sunlight. Roads once lined with apple trees were now rivers of mud and twisted metal. Everywhere the eye could see Shermans, lines of them stretching for miles, rolling through shattered villages and abandoned farmhouses. The great retreat of the Wehrmacht had begun. What was once an unstoppable German army now fled under relentless pursuit. Their lines shattered, their supplies gone, their fuel almost empty. For the first time in the war, German soldiers feared the sound of engines, not their own, but those of the Shermans chasing them. Captain William "Bill" Hardin, commanding a Sherman named Victory Bell, stood half out of the turret as his column advanced. The radio crackled with reports: enemy armor trapped, Panzer divisions encircled, thousands surrendering in the narrowing gap of the Falaise pocket. "Keep pushing," he barked, "don't give them a chance to breathe." Ahead, another column of German tanks tried to break through, Panthers and Tigers, their silhouettes rising from the smoke like ghosts of an empire refusing to die. But they were too few. Their ammunition was low, their crews exhausted. A Tiger fired from the treeline one precise, desperate shot. The shell slammed into Victory Bell's side armor, sending sparks and molten fragments through the cabin. The gunner screamed, clutching his arm, but the tank didn't stop. Hardin gritted his teeth, slammed his fist on the hatch, and yelled, "Load AP, fire back." The next shell hit the Tiger's turret ring. The German tank stopped moving, then erupted in a thunderclap of orange and black. Through the smoke, Hardin could see them, dozens of German crews abandoning their tanks, hands raised, faces pale. They stumbled past the wrecks of their machines, muttering words the Americans couldn't understand. One German, barely more than a boy, stared in disbelief as yet another wave of Shermans thundered past. "So many," he whispered in broken English. "How do you make so many?" Hardin didn't answer. He didn't need to. Behind him, the endless convoy of Shermans stretched to the horizon, a living reminder that the war was no longer about who had the best machine but who had the greatest will to endure. Miles away, Oberfeldwebel Kurt Reinhardt sat in the ruins of a captured village. His Panzer IV was out of fuel. His crew was gone. He had fought since Poland, survived France, Russia, and Africa, but this was different. This wasn't defeat by tactics or bravery, it was defeat by momentum. He heard them before he saw them, the rhythmic growl of engines, the steady crunch of treads over stone. Dozens of Shermans rolled into view, their olive-drab hulls gleaming with dust and sunlight. American flags fluttered on antennas. Reinhardt stood beside his motionless tank and watched them pass. For a brief second, one of the Shermans slowed. The commander looked at him not with hatred but pity, then the engine roared again and the machine rolled on, leaving him behind in silence. The laughter that had once echoed through the French fields in 1942 was now a ghost, drowned beneath the roar of 1,000 American engines. And as the Shermans rolled east toward Germany, Reinhardt finally understood the truth. Wars aren't always won by the strongest weapon, but by the nation that refuses to stop building. March 1945. The Rhine River, Remagen, Germany. Dawn broke over the shattered skyline like a wound opening to the light. The once proud towns of the Rhineland lay silent, rooftops caved in, church steeples blackened by fire, bridges shattered into the mist below. But one bridge still stood, the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. And on that bridge, the M4 Shermans were coming. Lieutenant Harris, the same man who'd fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, now led his platoon across the steel span. Beneath the bridge, artillery shells exploded in the water like thunder. The air stank of cordite and rust. Every rumble of the treads echoed like the heartbeat of an advancing empire. "Keep moving," Harris shouted through the din. "Don't stop for anything." The bridge creaked beneath the weight of steel. German engineers had wired it with explosives, but the charges had failed to detonate. A miracle or perhaps fate. Either way, it meant the Allies had found their door into Germany itself. From the far bank, scattered German defenders opened fire, machine guns rattling, mortars bursting in plumes of smoke. But the Shermans didn't stop. Their treads clanged over the bridge's ribs, their cannons barking in steady rhythm. One tank took a direct hit, its turret torn open, but the column behind it didn't waver. Reinhardt was there too, not as a commander anymore, but as a broken soldier retreating toward the interior. He watched from a hillside as the American armor poured across the Rhine, the same tanks he had once mocked now rumbling over the last natural barrier to Germany's heartland. He whispered to himself, "So this is how it ends." By nightfall, Allied tanks had secured the eastern bank. Engineers rushed to reinforce the bridge while more Shermans crossed, their headlights cutting through the darkness like ghosts of inevitability. Within weeks, American armor was sweeping through the Ruhr Valley, crushing what remained of the Wehrmacht's resistance. Everywhere they went, civilians watched from doorways, silent, pale, resigned. Town after town, village after village, the same sight repeated. Shermans rolling past the ruins, their crews waving, their tracks clattering against cobblestone streets that had once flown swastika banners. Inside one captured city square, an elderly German mechanic stood beside his ruined workshop, staring at the American tanks with hollow eyes. "So many," he murmured. "We built for precision, you built for eternity." By May, the war was over. The laughter that had begun in 1942, born from arrogance and pride, had long since died in the mud and smoke of Europe. The M4 Sherman wasn't the strongest tank, it wasn't the fastest or the most heavily armored, but it was enough. It could be built faster than it could be destroyed. It could climb hills, cross bridges, and keep rolling long after the enemy had run out of fuel, metal, and hope. As the last German divisions surrendered, Lieutenant Harris parked his Sherman on a quiet hill overlooking the Rhine. He stepped out, looked toward the west, and lit a cigarette. The war had taken years of his youth and countless lives. But as the smoke curled into the cold morning air, he whispered the same words spoken by so many who had seen the tide turn. "They laughed at us once, but we never stopped coming." And in the silence that followed, the sound of the engines faded, the war ending not with a single shot, but with the steady hum of machines that had done the impossible. Summer 1945. Somewhere near Frankfurt, Germany. The guns had gone quiet. The thunder of artillery that once shook the earth was replaced by the distant rumble of trucks and the soft hum of engines moving food, medicine, and rebuilding supplies. Where there had been destruction, there was now rebuilding, slow, uncertain, but real. Rows of Shermans stood parked along the cobblestone streets of a captured German town. Their hulls were streaked with soot and rain, their paint chipped by months of battle, yet they looked alive like beasts finally allowed to rest after a long, brutal hunt. Sergeant James Mallory, who had once prayed inside his Sherman during the chaos of Normandy, now leaned against its side, a cigarette hanging from his lips. Children watched him from behind the ruins of a bakery, whispering in German, wide-eyed and cautious. One boy pointed to the tank's white star, tracing its outline in the air. Mallory smiled faintly, handing him a rationed chocolate bar. "Here," he said softly, "you'll like this." The boy took it, hesitating, then ran back to his mother, a small act of humanity among ruins. In the months that followed, many of those same tanks that had broken Germany's lines were repurposed, used to haul debris, deliver aid, or serve in training camps for a new world already trembling under the shadow of another conflict, the Cold War. The Sherman, mocked by its enemies and often underestimated by its own crews, became something greater than anyone expected. It became a symbol of persistence, of practicality, of a nation that refused to give up. German officers captured after the war often admitted their surprise. "You had more tanks than we had bullets," one said during an interrogation. "But it wasn't just numbers, your tanks never stopped moving. Even when we destroyed one, 5 more appeared. We couldn't outfight that, we couldn't outbuild that." The laughter from 1942, the taunts about inferior American armor, had turned to disbelief. And disbelief, at last, to respect. Years later, when Kurt Reinhardt was an old man living in a quiet corner of Bavaria, he visited a war museum in Munich. There, among the restored Panzers and rusted relics, stood an M4 Sherman, its armor still dented, its tracks preserved, a faint star painted on its side. He stood before it for a long time, hand trembling as he reached out to touch the cold steel. Memories flooded back, the laughter of his crew, the roar of engines, the endless columns rolling across France. He lowered his hand and said quietly, almost to himself, "You were never the best tank, but you were the one that never stopped coming." The curator nearby didn't understand his words, but the look in the old man's eyes said enough. The Sherman had done what no weapon before it had achieved, not by terror, not by design perfection, but by endurance. It was the tank that outlasted tyranny, the tank that carried not just soldiers but a nation's will across an ocean and through the heart of war. And long after the battlefields turned to grass and the guns went silent, the echo of its treads could still be heard, a reminder that victory doesn't always belong to the most powerful but to the most persistent. Winter 1944. The Ardennes, Belgium. Snow fell in thick flakes, blanketing shattered fields in a deceptive calm. The smell of wet wool, grease, and gunpowder hung in the air as the men of Company B, 2nd Armored Division, dug their heels into the frozen mud. Inside each Sherman, engines hummed like caged animals, ready to surge forward at a moment's notice. Private Samuel "Sammy" Jenkins, barely 19, shivered in his steel confines, helmet pressed tight. His breath fogged the interior glass as he watched the frost crawling along the viewport. Every clank and groan of the tank sounded louder in the stillness, and every shadow could hide a panther or tiger waiting to strike. Life in the Sherman wasn't glamorous. Crews shared rations that were often cold, slept in their tanks under blankets soaked with oil, and carried the constant weight of anticipation. Yet, even in the mud and misery, there was camaraderie. Corporal Frank Delaney, the gunner, tapped Sammy's shoulder. "Eyes up, kid, keep your head down but don't lose it. Tanks move fast, bullets faster, but we're still here." The Sherman's interior, cramped and metallic, became a world unto itself. Crew members relied on each other for survival, not just skill but trust. Every hatch open meant exposure. Every turret rotation could mean death. But for every horror there was small humor, a shared joke, a whispered dare, or the absurdity of singing in harmony over the roar of 75 rounds. And yet the Germans laughed less than they once did. Stories of Sherman resilience, its ability to keep rolling after hits, its nimbleness in confined hedgerows, and the sheer numbers arriving day after day spread through enemy ranks. The myth of invincibility in German armor was cracking, not because of brilliance but because of relentless persistence. Normandy ports, July 1944. The roar of Sherman engines on the battlefield was impressive, but the real victory started thousands of miles away, in the ports and factories of the United States. Dockworkers unloaded tanks and supplies from Liberty ships under hot sun and pounding rain. Cranes swung massive hulls into position, and the noise of welders and hammering seemed to sync with the distant echoes of artillery in France. Each Sherman required thousands of parts: engines, transmissions, radios, armor plates. A single mistake in production could stall a company, but the assembly lines never stopped. Engineers innovated on the fly. If a suspension system failed in one tank, the next unit received a modification that worked. Repairs were simplified. Crews could replace a transmission in hours, not days. Captain Thomas Avery, coordinating supply convoys, watched over a yard of Sherman spares. "These tanks are more than machines," he said to his lieutenant. "They're hope wrapped in steel, and if the enemy thinks they can destroy it faster than we can replace it, they're wrong." This industrial rhythm wasn't glamorous, but it was decisive. Where Germany relied on technical superiority in smaller numbers, the Allies relied on numbers, predictability, and repairability. The Sherman could be hit, damaged, burned, and another would always arrive to take its place. By late 1944, German commanders whispered to each other in disbelief. "They don't stop," one muttered. "Even when we destroy one, 5 more appear." The words became a refrain, despair wrapped in shock. July 1944, hedgerows of Normandy. The terrain of Normandy had been designed long before the war: high, dense hedges dividing fields into small plots. For German defenders, it was perfect. For American tank crews, it was a nightmare. Sherman crews had to adapt. Lieutenant Harris directed his column through narrow lanes. Tanks crept forward, turrets swiveling, machine guns spitting fire. A tiger lurked around a bend, massive, intimidating, a ghost of every nightmare Reinhardt had once bragged about. Yet the Sherman's design, though modest, excelled in flexibility. Crews combined infantry, artillery, and air support to neutralize threats. One Sherman would fire a smoke round to obscure the approach, another would flank, a third would fire repeatedly to suppress enemy crews. The Germans could not match the coordinated approach, not in numbers, not in endurance. Private Jenkins remembered the first Panther they saw in hedgerows. Its long barrel seemed to reach forever, and his heart pounded. Yet, after 2 flanking maneuvers, careful positioning, and a well-timed rocket from an accompanying infantry team, the Panther was immobilized. Its crew surrendered, shocked, disbelieving, humiliated. Every encounter like this repeated across Normandy. The Sherman was never a perfect duelist, but combined with strategy, coordination, and relentless numbers, it became unstoppable. German soldiers went from mocking laughter to disbelief to fear, all without the Allies ever needing a single miracle weapon. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow fell in thick sheets, turning the forest into a white, silent prison. The trees groaned under the weight, and every crunch of boots or treads echoed like gunfire. The Germans struck like a winter storm, a surprise offensive aimed at breaking through the Allied lines and capturing Antwerp. For the Americans, the nightmare was immediate. Private Samuel Jenkins clutched the side of his Sherman turret as artillery shells exploded in the frozen trees. Frostbitten fingers worked the controls, eyes scanning every shadow. The forest was deceptive. A panther could be hiding behind any trunk, a tiger poised to fire through the white haze. Lieutenant Harris's voice crackled over the radio. "Hold your positions, don't advance blindly, use cover, coordinate with infantry." The Shermans moved cautiously, engines low, their treads crunching frozen mud. Despite their smaller guns compared to German Tigers, the Shermans had something the Germans didn't: numbers, coordination, and endurance. Corporal Frank Delaney directed his squad, ducking inside the turret. "Flank left, smoke out, keep rolling." He fired a round that struck a Panther's side armor. Sparks flew, the metal groaned, and the German tank halted. Another Sherman joined, and together they forced the crew to abandon the vehicle. Hours stretched into days. Snow mixed with blood and oil in the frozen earth. Crews huddled in tanks at night, sharing meager rations, telling stories to keep hope alive. Outside, the Ardennes forests whispered of death, yet inside the Shermans, men felt the pulse of endurance, of machines that refused to die and soldiers who refused to quit. By the time reinforcements arrived, the Germans were in retreat. The bulge had failed and the Shermans, battered and scarred, had kept rolling forward. Laughter from 2 years prior when Reinhardt mocked the M4 Sherman as a toy was now long gone, replaced by awe, fear, and grudging respect. February 1945. The Rhineland, Germany. Snow had melted into slush, turning the roads into rivers of mud and metal. German cities braced for the inevitable, their defenses hastily reconstructed, their hopes clinging to the last tigers and panthers that remained. Lieutenant Harris and his men rolled into Cologne, navigating streets that were almost unrecognizable, buildings reduced to skeletal frames, cobblestones cracked and uneven. Civilians peeked from basements and ruined windows, eyes wide, mouths silent. The Shermans clanked through like ghosts of inevitability. Oberfeldwebel Reinhardt, now commanding a skeleton crew of Panzer IVs, watched from a hilltop. His pride, once sharp as steel, had dulled to ash. The American armor was relentless. For every tank he destroyed, 2 more appeared, his officers whispered. It's the factories the Americans never stop building. Reinhardt's memories returned to 1942, the first laugh at the Sherman, the contempt for its thin armor and weak gun. Now those same machines were in the streets of Germany, the country that had once believed itself invincible. Sherman crews worked in tandem with engineers and infantry. Bridges were repaired under fire, rivers crossed, towns cleared. Tanks that had been damaged weeks prior were repaired and returned to the line. By mid-February, the Allies had secured key industrial centers: Ruhr, Cologne, Dusseldorf. The M4 Sherman had done its final work, breaking the back of German logistics. March 1945, near Remagen, Germany. The Ludendorff Bridge loomed across the Rhine, still intact despite desperate German attempts to destroy it. Harris guided his Sherman to the bridgehead, engines throbbing, smoke trailing behind. German defenders opened fire, but the Americans pressed on. Reinhardt had barely enough fuel to retreat. His Panzer IVs were scattered. Many crews surrendered without firing a shot, stunned by the unstoppable tide of Shermans. One young German soldier, no older than Jenkins, stared at the tanks with wide eyes. "You so many," he whispered. Harris didn't answer. He merely pressed forward, the Sherman's treads biting the road, its cannon silent but menacing. Every tank that crossed the Rhine reinforced the simple truth: Germany could not outfight, outbuild, or outlast this machine and the nation behind it. The American tanks advanced not in brilliance but in persistence. They moved as one, coordinated by radio, backed by air, infantry, and artillery. By March, the Rhine was crossed, the heart of Germany penetrated, and the war's outcome sealed. April 1945, Bavaria, Germany. The countryside was green again but littered with ruins, remnants of towns, tanks, and soldiers who had fought and died. Harris and his men patrolled the outskirts of Munich. The Shermans, many scarred and dented, had become familiar companions. Each one told a story: smoke from a Tiger round, a night spent in mud, a village cleared under fire. Reinhardt's Panzer IV was abandoned on a hill. He sat nearby, reflecting on the years of conflict. The machines he once revered had been no match for relentless persistence, logistics, and sheer numbers. The Sherman wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be, it only needed to keep moving, and it had. American soldiers walked among the ruins, shaking hands with liberated civilians, marking the end of a nightmare. Sherman crews cleaned their tanks, wrote letters home, and tried to rest, knowing that their machines, more than any other, had carried them through hell. Even the Germans, when they later recounted stories of the Sherman, spoke not of technical inferiority alone, but of the unyielding rhythm of American production and movement. The tanks that had once inspired laughter now inspired a grudging respect, a recognition that the war could be won by endurance as much as by firepower.